Hello, friends. Here we are in my kitchen. Woohoo! Welcome. Oh, dropping things everywhere. Just the incredible Hulk juice. Can't live without these in my house. Okay, so today we are going to talk about sectionalism. Obviously, sectionalism comes into play in a major way as we creep closer and closer to the Civil War. The roots of sectionalism, however, start during this time period. Well, I feel like sectionalism is something that's always been there, but maybe not totally defined during this whole time. We've had the middle Atlantic colonies, the northern colonies, the southern colonies. Now we have the north, the south, the west. Obviously, those divisions are going to become deeper. Passions are going to be greater. Nationalism to those, or not nationalism, but loyalty to those particular sections are going to grow. But it plays a major role that all these three sections are living three different ways. So sectionalism becomes a big issue in our budding country. I love this quote from Daniel Webster, who was a prominent New England, specifically New Hampshire politician. Says this on March 7th, 1850. The East, the West, and the stormy South all combined to throw the whole ocean into commotion, to toss its billows to the skies, and to disclose its profoundest depths. All right, let's talk about, first, we'll talk about the North and the fact that the North is highly industrialized or working its way to be highly industrialized. By the 1830s, the northern factories were producing a wide range of goods, and everything from farm implements to clocks and shoes. This is also a time when we start to see organized labor. Here in the United States, the first U.S. Labor Party is formed in Philadelphia in 1828. Organized labor pushed for improvement for workers. They were looking for fair wages and fair wages across the board. Safety, obviously, you want to work someplace where you're not going to be in fear of losing your life, hurting yourself. And if you did get hurt, that you would have the opportunity to still have a job to go back to. During this time period, they would, if you hurt yourself, they'd find another body to fill your place. They didn't let you go on leave or pay you workman's comp while you were out sick and then come back to a job. It didn't work like that. Unions also, or organized labor also pushed for work hours. Pushed to have, an 8-hour, 9-hour workday, not that you would go and toil in the mines for 16 hours. Was not a good thing. The unions were limited by periodic depressions, employers and courts that were hostile, and of course, abundant supply of cheap immigrant labor. Immigrants didn't typically join the unions because they didn't have a lot of money to pay for the fees, but also they didn't benefit from it as much as non-immigrants would. Urban life. So here in the industrialized North, we start to see more of an urban type of life shaping for its people, which is very different from the experiences in the South and very different from the experiences in the West. Urban population grew from approximately 5% of the population in 1800 to 15% of the population by 1850. As a result, the rapid expansion and growth of cities led to the growth of slums. Slums are poor housing situations, poor sanitation, lots of people living in a very small space because this is what they can afford since they are making very low wages at their jobs. So crowded housing, poor sanitation, infectious disease, and high rate of crimes becomes kind of the telltale sign of what urbanization looks like at this time period. And immigrants, of course, keep on coming because in some cases, these poor living situations are better than what they had before. So why not? And they still have opportunity of working and finding a place to live. So African Americans in the industrialized North, 250,000 African Americans live in the North by 1860. They made up just about 1% of the North population of the North. However, they represented 50% of all free African Americans. They had freedom to own land. They had a family, or they could have a family. They had no economic or political equality, however. So, you know, six of one, half a dozen of the other. They're allowed their freedom, but they can't vote, no say in politics, and they have to deal with the wages of whatever they're going to get from whoever's going to pay them, because they have no place in society to say, hey, I'm working as hard as this guy, I deserve the same amount of money. It's just not going to happen. Racism definitely existed, which kept them out of skilled jobs. So they did a lot of manual labor and a lot of crappy jobs that folks didn't want to do. So it wasn't a great situation for them, even though there was no slavery in the North. Northerners were not apt to open their doors and say, come, sit down and have Sunday dinner with me. Immigration, another group of marginalized folks during this time period. After 1832, a number of new immigrants arrived to America. The number never fell below 50,000 a year. In 1 year alone, 1854, the number climbed as high as 428,000 immigrants. Between 1830 and 1850, 4 million people from Northern Europe headed to the U.S. They landed in big cities, and they either stayed in those big cities or they headed to farms, because a lot of these people had little skills in terms of industrialization, but they could farm or work on a farm. So why are all these immigrants coming? What's so great? What's happening? Well, a couple things. One, we had developed inexpensive and relatively rapid ocean transportation. So you could get from point A to point B in less than, it used to be a couple months, then it was a month. Now it's short, the time is getting much shorter, making it more convenient and cheap, which is key because a lot of these people are broke. There are issues with food shortages, famines, political revolutions happening in Europe, and people are sick of dealing with it. So they're going to come here and try living, the American dream, I guess. And of course, the U.S. has a growing reputation as a country offering economic opportunities and political freedoms. In some ways, I think these economic opportunities and political freedoms are a little bit of a pipe dream and blown out of proportion. Like the streets aren't littered with jobs or gold. You have to find something. But for a lot of these people, especially those escaping famine and really hard times in their countries, anything even a smidge better is going to improve their life exponentially. That's not the right word. It's going to improve their lives a lot. So why not give it a try? Immigrants, of course, strengthen the U.S. economy by providing a steady stream of inexpensive labor and increased demand for mass-produced consumer goods. They are making some money, so now they want to spend their money, which is always a good recipe. A majority of these immigrants are coming, like we said, from Northern Europe, so we're going to see a lot of Irish and a lot of Germans. The Irish are going to face real serious issues when they get here. They are treated terribly. In some cases because they're Catholic, but they're just treated worse than, they're just treated so terribly. They can't find places to live. They can't find places to work. They do come together as a community, however, and end up kicking a lot of butt. But in the beginning, it's very hard for them. And then we see an increase in the nativist movement. And nativists are folks who are born in America and they want to keep America immigrant free, or make sure that all white folks in America are the first people to get the jobs and the good wages and the good apartments and so on and so forth. So we're going to see this as immigration increases. We're going to see an increase in this nativist movement. And a lot of immigrants suffer from that, which is unfortunate. Now let's move on to the North. North has a totally different atmosphere happening. Agriculture is the foundation of the South's economy. They are growing tobacco, rice, sugarcane as cash crops, but of course cotton is the king. And anybody that can grow cotton is growing cotton, and they're growing a lot of it. Just to give you some example, by 1850, cotton provided 2/3 of all U.S. exports and linked the South to Great Britain. So we are exporting a ton of cotton, and we're sending it to Europe, Great Britain, and then it's being processed and sent all over the world. So it's really doing us a lot of favors, actually. Unfortunately, hand in hand with cotton as a cash crop comes the peculiar institution of slavery. Wealth in the South is measured by land and slaves. How big is your plantation? How many acres of cotton or crops are you planting? And how many slaves do you own? The more you have, the more wealth and power you have. The cotton boom is responsible for an increased number of slaves over a 60-year span. In 1800, we have 1 million slaves here in America. By 1860, we have 4 million. In parts of the Deep South, slaves made up more than 75% of the total population. Many whites feared slave revolts and riots. As a result, there were strict restrictions on slaves' movements. You can't just go from one plantation to the next. That was strictly prohibited. And education, couldn't learn to read or write, because if you educate somebody, they might have a thought on their own. And then, of course, many states set up slave codes, just rules and regulations about what you could and could not do. Most slaves labored in the fields, but many learned skilled crafts and worked as house servants in factories and or on construction gangs. Conditions of slavery varied from one plantation to the next. Some were treated well, and I'm going to use that sparingly. They're still slaves. Take it with a grain of salt. Others were routinely beaten. Women were definitely vulnerable for rape, assault, so on and so forth. A very bad situation all the way around. We'll talk more in class about the difference between a field hand and a house slave eventually, but just trying to get through this here. By 1860, as many as 250,000 African Americans in the South were not slaves. They were free citizens. A number had been emancipated during the American Revolutionary War. You remember, if they fought for the fought for the Patriots, they would be given their freedom. Some were mulatto children, which is actually a derogatory term for mixed children whose white fathers decided to liberate them once they were born. Others achieved freedom on their own. The freed African Americans living in the South mostly lived in the more populated cities where they could own property. They were, of course, even though they could own property, they were still unequal to whites. Even though they had their freedom, they were still unequal to whites. They were not permitted to vote. And of course, they were barred from entering certain occupations. So racism, segregation, still alive and well, even if you are free. The whites in the South, of course, lived by a rigid code of hierarchy. The South was so different from the North. It was still very aristocratic, almost old world European. Aristocratic planters lived comfortably at the top of society, while poor farmers and mountain people, which we'll get into in a bit, struggled at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder of the South. 3/4 of the whites population could not afford slaves, which is pretty significant. They lived in the hills and they were subsistence farmers.